So today we're going to focus on the stomach. So we talked about chewing and saliva and swallowing and peristalsis of the food down the esophagus on, I guess that was a week ago today. And now we're going to talk about what happens when that food reaches the stomach. So we're going to do some anatomy. The stomach has a lot more anatomy than just the stomach. We'll talk about the cells and enzymes that work on food in the stomach and hormones that control that, secretions. We'll understand secretion and the control of secretion of gastric acid. That's the key thing in the stomach. The acidic environment of the stomach and how that is achieved and how that is controlled. We'll talk about an enzyme that functions in the stomach to hydrolyze protein, and if there's time, we'll get to ulcers, gastric ulcers. So the stomach has, so here's a cartoon of the stomach that has a lot of the names. So here's the esophagus. At the base, at the bottom of the esophagus, at its junction to the stomach, is the lower esophageal sphincter that controls flow of the bolus of food into the stomach. The region of the stomach where, region of the stomach at the junction with the esophagus is called the cardia. The region of the stomach above the cardia, making this bulge, is called the fundus. The region of the stomach below the fundus is called the body. The region of the stomach below the body is called the antrum, sometimes called the pyloric antrum. There's a bunch of variants here of this nomenclature. I want you to know the name antrum. And then the sphincter at the exit end of the stomach is called the pylorus or the pyloric sphincter. I use those names interchangeably. So the pyloric sphincter is the exit from the stomach, and the lower esophageal sphincter is the entrance to the stomach. Then there's some other names here. So there's the pyloric canal, and there's some books talk about the antrum of the pylorus as opposed to the pyloric antrum. Whatever. Antrum, then the pyloric sphincter. This region right here, right before the pyloric sphincter, is often called the pylorus. Okay, those are the big sections of the stomach: cardia, fundus, body, antrum, pylorus. Then there's some other things to know. There are layers of muscle, smooth muscle on the outside of the stomach. 3 layers, muscles that are arranged longitudinally, called longitudinal muscle. Muscles that are arranged circularly, called circular muscles, and muscles that are arranged at an angle, called oblique muscles. Knowing those 3 names is pretty easy. The outside curvature of the stomach is called the greater curvature, and the inside curvature of the stomach is called the lesser curvature. So that's anatomical nomenclature. The output from the stomach into the small intestine is to a section of the small intestine called the duodenum, or duodenum. Kendra.
Are the muscle, like circular, oblique, longitudinal, are they specific to the layers of the stomach? Like, for example, like I would say the oblique, not the oblique layer, I'm so sorry.
So circular and longitudinal muscles are going to be ubiquitous throughout the digestive tract. Oblique is somewhat specific for the stomach. Okay, so I think I've covered all the words on this slide. And then there's a few other slides that, okay. All right, let's do it quickly. This is going backwards a little bit. So this is a review of material from a week ago. We take a bite of food and chew. What's happening now? Okay. Some of you are getting it all right, and some of you are getting it partially right. A, B, and C are correct. Protein is not hydrolyzed enzymatically by saliva, but lipid and carbohydrate is. Lingual lipase and salivary amylase. You swallow the bolus of food, what happens? Okay, good. I was seeing a lot of the correct answers. Swallowing is a complex neurophysiological response, and food is propelled to the stomach by peristalsis, not by gravity. The epiglottis closes. Okay, so here is a cartoon from your textbook. I think I've already talked about most of these words. Lower esophageal sphincters, fundus, body, antrum, pylorus. Pyloric sphincter, yeah. Okay, one more new word. The ridges on the inside of the stomach are called rugae. That's a name of an anatomical part of the stomach. Rugae. Or gastric rugae. Anything gastric is just referring to the stomach. Yes?
Wasn't that spelled A?
Yes, it should be AE. So some of you may remember from years past that there used to be a program, this game, and we could pass the laser around and we could get a happy bing sound when someone got it right. They've taken all those programs down, so they're not up on the internet anymore. So this is just a screen, this is just a dead screenshot. But we can still play the game. pick a, well, let me, here. Yeah, let's play the game. Pick a word, and then pick a dot, and label it.
So the duodenum is there.
Okay, that would be the duodenum. Right, this is pointing to the duodenum. Okay, that would be pointing to the lesser curvature. This is the lesser curvature.
This is the gastric rugae?
This is pointing to these folds, which is the gastric rugae. That is the esophagus.
This is the fundus.
That is the fundus. This one right here is the fundus.
That's the circular muscle.
That is indeed the circular muscle. There's only two left. You can probably, I think I've used some of these, I've used at least one of these words in lab. So the greater omentum is left, and the serosa is left. And one of those words I mentioned in lab, and the other is new, so we'll learn about it.
It's the greater omentum.
That is the greater omentum, dangling off the greater curvature of the stomach. And so, okay, Matt, you got it easy. Well, I'm going to do it for you because the serosa, it's pointing to the outside layer of the stomach. So the external surface of the stomach is called the serosa. Okay, let's do it again. Matt, now you have a greater, okay.
So which one is the one like up on the left supposed to be the
Oh, body.
Cause that,
What's that?
you said that's where like the cardia was, like that's
So,
the only one I thought we did.
Cardia is here. This could be the body, but it could also be pointing to the serosa, so there's some ambiguity here. Maybe this is pointing, so this would be a legitimate answer for both body and for serosa. I don't see something clearly, this would also be legitimate for body, except that it's pointing to the ruby. So, something funny about
So
this.
you would call that one that we didn't mark off the.
This one
the
here?
Cardia?
I would call this one the cardia. Yeah, I would call that the cardia. So that one's not on the list. So maybe this is body and this is pointing to serosa, the surface. Some ambiguity here in this kind of stuff. If I were to use this on a quiz or a test, I would articulate the surface, the name of this surface, the name of this part of the stomach in order to clarify which dot was what I was looking for.
Alright, that is the greater curvature.
Okay, this is the greater curvature.
Oblique muscle.
Oblique muscle.
It's the diaphragm.
That is the diaphragm. Yes, it is, indeed. That is the diaphragm.
This dot is the lesser omentum.
That is the lesser omentum. This fat and globs of whatever is the lesser omentum. Okay, so this is probably the pyloric sphincter, pointing to this muscle here that controls the opening of something else that has a name. That's the pyloric sphincter.
The cardia?
That would be the cardia. Thank you for carrying it back. Okay, Isaiah, you're up.
Pyloric canal.
Yeah, okay, well, this is probably the pyloric canal, pointing to this actual opening is the canal. So I would accept that. Go ahead and pass it on to Al.
So then would this be the pylorus?
Yeah, sure, let's call this the pylorus, or the pylorus of the pyloric region, that's a little redundant. This is the pylorus.
And then wouldn't this be the atrium of the pyloric region?
That would be the antrum,
Or
not
antrum.
atrium, antrum of the pyloric region. Yes, let's just call it the antrum. So cardia, fundus, body, antrum, pylorus, pyloric sphincter. I understand, if you say pyloric canal and it's pointing to the muscle, I might say, what? But it's the pyloric sphincter controls the pylorus, or the pyloric, well, the pyloric canal. This is the pylorus. Have we done everything? I think we have. Sorry. Okay, so let's talk about what that stomach does, what that stomach muscle does. We know what the stomach does. Let's talk about what the gastric muscles, the longitudinal, the circular, and the oblique muscles do. What they do is contract in a rhythmic and organized fashion, not quite as rhythmic as your heart and not quite as well organized as your heart, but in a fairly well organized pattern to stir up, to churn the food that's in your stomach. So this is smooth muscle. It's controlled by a network of nerve cells that control the movement of these muscles, or control the contraction of these muscles. And then, so this is supposed to illustrate just sort of, squeezing, I don't know, it's a funny cartoon, squeezing and churning of the contents of the muscle, of the stomach by the muscle. And then, so we're gonna talk about gastric acid, and we're gonna talk about pepsin, and the food is all mixed together in the lumen of the stomach, and it's mixed and churned by the smooth muscle. And now I forgot to load this, but I'm gonna show you because it's really quite amazing. So, this is a movie, and not an animation, but an actual movie of someone's stomach that has been cleaned out, so it's nice and clean. It doesn't have any food in it. It's all, you'll see it's all shiny and slippery because it's got mucus in it, but it doesn't have any food. And the stomach has been stimulated to do gastric motility even though it has no food in it. So it's been stimulated chemically to do its thing. So those are the smooth muscles churning, taking a bolus of food and squeezing it down. So you can see this thing, I mean, it looks fairly alien, doesn't it, living inside your body. Sort of this wave of contraction that takes a blob of what's in the stomach and squeezes it. And then it opens and lets that squeeze mix around. So now it's relaxing, and now another wave. So this is endoscopy. This is actual camera introduced into somebody's stomach. Opening of this part of the stomach. Relaxation of smooth muscle. Now a wave of contraction. Who knew you had something like that living inside you? I mean, I just think it looks like something out of the deep sea or something. That's what's going on in your stomach after you eat and you start to churn the food. So that's the physical, that's what's going on physically. Now we're going to start to talk about chemical things. Where's that other pointer? So the little brighter than the one I have. So here is a cartoon of the stomach with some names that you're starting to learn. Here is a blow-up of the inner surface of the stomach. So this would be the serosa. And here are longitudinal and circular muscle. Not shown are the oblique muscles. And remember, we have the lamina propria here, and the epithelial cells and the mucosa, the mucosal surface, is deeply folded into those rugae, the gastric rugae. And we're going to see folds throughout the digestive system, but in the stomach they're called rugae. These folds, so here is a cartoon of one of these folds, right? So this is the stomach lumen here, and this is a fold, this fold right here, let's say. And it's lined with epithelial cells, mostly, but they have different functions. So there are epithelial cells called mucus cells, whose job is to secrete mucus. So there's a cell type that you know from the respiratory system that secretes mucus, goblet cells. So the mucus cells of the stomach are like the goblet cells of the respiratory tract. Their job is to secrete mucus. And you know what mucus is, and I could show you those incredible videos of slime coming from a slime eel, but we won't do that. So mucus cells. Remember, mucus is part of what's going on in the stomach. Mucus is secreted to protect the surface of the stomach from that gastric acid that we'll talk about in a minute. The name of the cells that secrete gastric acid are parietal cells. So these are the cells that secrete hydrochloric acid. The name of the cells that secrete a precursor to pepsin, called pepsinogen, and this is a common thread you're going to see. If you see the name ogen, it's a precursor. Like angiotensinogen was a precursor to angiotensin. Pepsinogen is a precursor to pepsin. We're going to see that again and again. So chief cells are the cells of the gastric fold that secrete pepsinogen. And endocrine cells are not epithelial cells, really. They are endocrine cells that respond to various changes and secrete hormones. So we're going to talk about some hormones. But the point is, the stomach has its own endocrinology, and we'll see that. I'll clarify that. But in these folds, which are often called a gland, but I find the name confusing because I think of glands like glands with ducts. The pancreas is a gland that secretes pancreatic juice into a duct. The salivary glands are glands that secrete saliva into a duct and then into your mouth. A sweat gland is a gland that secretes sweat into a duct and then it goes out onto your skin. But these are often called glands, even though there is no real duct. Whatever. Let's just call it folds. These gastric folds have these key cell types: mucus cells, parietal cells, chief cells, and endocrine cells. Those are the ones I want you to know about. These superficial cells, whatever. Stem cells, now this is an interesting thing about biology, because these cells are constantly turning over, because they're getting destroyed by the acid, there is a constant regeneration of the cells of the stomach lining. And those cells come from the stem cells. So there's a very abundant stem cell niche in the stomach lining in order to produce the cells that get recycled and killed off by the acid. Killed off by the acid and then recycled. Okay, so now we're going to start to talk about what these cell types do. Well, before we do that, we're going to talk about some of the microanatomy. So you may have noticed that these cells have these little teeth, these teethy things on them. All of these cells have this thing, right? What is this supposed to illustrate? It's supposed to, they don't have teeth. They have microvilli. There is a very folded surface of the apical surface of these epithelial cells. So that's what when the cartoonist was cartooning these cells, they put these jagged teeth on them. They look like teeth, they're not teeth, they're microvilli. And that's what they really look like. You know all about mucus. Mucus secretion is important. So mucus, and luckily the name is pretty straightforward. Mucus cells secrete mucus. The spelling is a little different. Mucus, C-O-U-S cells secrete mucus, C-U-S. I'm not going to hold you responsible for spelling. Okay, mucus. Acid. This is key. This is one of the two most important jobs of the stomach is to secrete acid. Parietal cells are the cells that do this. Here is how they do this. Carbonic anhydrase is essential, again, to turn carbon dioxide into carbonic acid inside the cells. So there's carbonic acid inside the cells, made by carbonic anhydrase from the CO2 that's everywhere. 40 millimeters of mercury of CO2 is everywhere. Carbonic acid dissociates into protons and bicarbonate. Here is the serosa, or the serosal side. It's not really the serosa because we're still in the endocrine, but this is the blood side, and this is the lumen of the stomach over here. So this acid, let's not get into this weird chemistry, I don't know why they do this. This acid is pumped by a proton ATPase into the lumen of the stomach. It actually is a proton potassium ATPase, but the most important function is that it's pumping this is like the sodium potassium ATPase that is key for so many things, especially in the kidney. You learned all about the sodium potassium ATPase. Now we have a proton potassium ATPase. Pumps protons into the lumen of the stomach. Where did those protons come from? They came from carbonic acid. Pumping protons is accompanied by chloride flowing down its concentration gradient, or its electrochemical gradient, in response to pumping those protons through a chloride channel. So protons are pumped and chloride flows passively. And there's HCl, there's hydrochloric acid. Let's not worry about this K channel, it's not that important. The other product of the dissociation of carbonic acid is bicarbonate, and bicarbonate is pumped or exchanged out the basolateral surface with chloride. So bicarbonate is pumped into the bloodstream when the parietal cells are pumping acid into the stomach. That's the mechanism of acid secretion. So let's do a clicker. Good. You did this on the test, right? I asked you a question about this on the kidney test. Digestion is secreting acid into the stomach. So what happens to plasma pH? It increases because we're pumping bicarbonate into the plasma. That's metabolic alkalosis. And you did this on the test. So rather than force you to do it again, I'll see whether you got it right on the test. Okay, so we're not going to do that. On the test, I asked you to show me the renal response, but there would also be a respiratory response to this metabolic alkalosis, which I could ask you about on the final. If there's time, we can come back and do this, but I just want to, you did this on the test. I feel like I'm beating you up with the Davenport diagram enough as it is, and I'm going to hit you again probably during the final, so why not just sort of,
I know what you're talking about.
you know this looks like, oh my God, I'll never understand this. But you already understand this. You already know this. Let's walk through this together. Okay, here is so we're looking at a parietal cell. So this is a cartoon, a somewhat simplified cartoon of this stimulated parietal cell. On this one, this is the lumen of the stomach over here, and this is the blood side. So this is basolateral. This is basolateral, and this is apical. Here are the endoplasmic reticulum vesicles that used to have, that had a large expression of the proton potassium ATPase. So you know that that's what we're doing, is we're getting to secretion, snare dependent, calcium dependent, secretion, exocytosis. No? Yes? Snare dependent, calcium dependent exocytosis of these vesicles into this membrane to put thousands more of these pumps into the apical membrane. Here are the receptors for all of those hormones and neurotransmitters. Yes, they are. Those are the receptors, and you know these stories. So let's take gastrin. Gastrin binds to a receptor called the gastrin receptor. It also has another name that I don't expect you to worry about. This is the gastrin receptor. This is a pretty crummy cartoon of it because you know it has to have 7 transmembrane alpha helices, and it's coupled to a alpha subunit, and the alpha subunit binds, when it was activated, it bound GTP. There's the alpha subunit, and this one is GQ. So this is GQ alpha. So the receptor binds gastrin, GQ alpha is activated, GTP binding, separation from the receptor and from beta gamma. GQ alpha, as you well know, activates phospholipase C. Phospholipase C cuts PIP2 into IP3 and diacylglycerol. You're expert on this. I know you are. Diacylglycerol and calcium released from the endoplasmic reticulum activate protein kinase C. Phosphorylation of proteins are important for secretion, so the calcium and protein kinase C are important for exocytosis of the vesicles that contain the proton potassium pump into the apical membrane. So, bottom line, gastrin activates a GQ pathway. And now you're off and running, now I went through it, but you should be able to plug in your GQ module and get from activation of GQ to increased expression of the proton potassium pump. Acetylcholine does the same thing. Different receptor, but coupled to GQ. So now I could ask you, how does acetylcholine, what's the molecular mechanism by which acetylcholine causes an increase in acid secretion? All you gotta know is GQ, all you gotta remember is the GQ module, and you're there. Now, I make it sound like it's simple. I know it's a lot of detail, and I expect the detail, so I know the devil is in the details, but conceptually, you have it. Histamine is coupled to GS. Now we could go through the GS story, but it's adenylyl cyclase, production of cyclic AMP, there it is, adenylyl cyclase, production of cyclic AMP, a different kinase, not PKC in this case, PKA, that phosphorylates probably the same substrate that leads to secretion or exocytosis of the proton pump, the proton potassium pump into the apical membrane. So I do want you to know that gastrin and histamine are GQ coupled, and gastrin and acetylcholine are GQ coupled, and histamine is GS coupled. Here is somatostatin. We don't talk too much about GI, but you may remember from cell-phys that GI is an inhibitory G protein. So whatever GS turns on, GI turns off. And so that's how this GI turns off this pathway. Let's not worry about prostaglandins. Let's not worry about calcium channels. I think we've covered everything else. So these are the molecular mechanisms by which gastrin, acetylcholine, and histamine increase expression of proton potassium pump in parietal cells during the gastric phase of digestion and the cephalic phase, and how somatostatin inhibits it. Ryan?
With how much detail should we be able to explain how PKC, PKA, and calcium increase expression?
It's not here, so no, I don't expect you to be able to say
Okay.
the substrate of PKC or the substrate of PKA. Calcium is probably interacting with synaptotagmin here. It's, remember snare proteins, but I wouldn't even ask you that. I mean, so I don't want you to know the substrate for the kinases or the calcium that trigger the exocytosis.
Okay.
I don't even know what they are. In the aquaporin story, I did want you to know that Krebs was one of the substrates of PKA, and that aquaporin was one of the substrates of PKA. But I didn't test you on it, but I still could. Okay, so molecular mechanisms. You know this is part of my shtick. So let's put this into a big context, and then we'll be done. Maybe a few minutes early, so a few minutes early. So cephalic phase is thinking, smelling, tasting food, chewing food. No food has gotten into your digestive tract yet, but it's happening in your head. And we have parasympathetic nerves that triggers acid secretion by the ACH receptor in the parietal cells. Then when food gets into your stomach, it stretches. If your food has any protein in it, which a typical meal does, so if your meal is nothing but a baked potato, having no protein in it, this effect won't happen because there's no peptides in it. But still that you would have stretch, so still you'd have distension. And still it would buffer the proton concentration, so 2 out of 3 of these things would happen even if you ate nothing but a baked potato. And that is going to trigger more acid secretion. The digestion of the baked potato is not going to be that affected by acid. So starches can be acid hydrolyzed, but pepsin doesn't work on starch. Pepsin only works on protein. But the churning and the acid would start to digest the baked potato. If you ate nothing but a glob of butter, and it has to be more than just a glob, right? Well, butter has protein in it, so let's do a blob of Crisco. I mean, this is gross, but I mean, you would stretch your stomach, and this would make you sick, I think. Your stomach would stretch, it would secrete acid, but the acid doesn't do much to fat. So this is the churning effect is what would happen if you were to eat a blob of fat. But typically you eat a mixed meal, hopefully, that has protein and fat and carbohydrate. And the point here is that peptides and amino acids are, as well as stretching and the buffering, cause acid secretion. And then later on, we're going to get into the intestinal phase. When the food, which is in your stomach, which is no longer food, it is now chyme because it's been churned up and mixed with acid. When that chyme gets squirted through the pyloric sphincter into the duodenum, we're going to have a whole other set of reflexes for the intestinal phase of digestion. So we're going to put that on hold until we get to the intestines either on Thursday or after break. So this is on hold. So this slide is from your textbook. It talks about, and it breaks it down by hormone. So here are the hormones that we have talked about so far. Gastric. We haven't talked about CCK and we haven't talked about secretin. We will when we get to the pancreas. But let's just look at what gastrin does. So gastrin is a peptide hormone. It's secreted by the stomach. by the endocrine cells of the stomach. We just talked about its stimuli. So the things that stimulate gastrin secretion are stretch of the stomach, amino acids and peptides in the stomach, and the parasympathetic nervous system. Remember, how did that happen? Where was the parasympathetic nervous system? Oops. Where was the parasympathetic nervous system? Right there. Right there. Right there's the parasympathetic nervous system activating gastrin secretion. If you have a very low pH in your stomach, like between meals, that inhibits gastrin secretion. So now what does those are what trigger and or inhibit gastrin secretion by the endocrine cells of the stomach. What does it do? Well, it stimulates acid secretion. We've been talking about that. That's a GQ story. It stimulates motility. It gets those smooth muscles churning. That's also a GQ story. It stimulates growth of the stomach. Well, we're pretty much steady state. I mean, I suppose as an infant, the stomach needs to grow, and gastrin is part of that response. For most of us, the growth of the stomach is not something that happens anymore. And it's going to have some effects on the pancreas and on the small intestine that we'll talk about when we get there. Okay, so gastrin isn't just affecting the stomach. It's having some other effects, but we'll talk about that when we get to that part of the digestive tract. So any questions then about stomach? Gastric acid secretion by the parietal cells, pepsinogen secretion by the chief cells. Don't forget mucus secretion by the mucus cells, which is more or less happening all the time. That's not hormonally stimulated. Any questions? Okay, then I guess we're 10 minutes early today. Use your 10 minutes productively. I know it's a busy time of year. Every 10 minutes